welcome back to True Crime with Emma Kenny. If this is your first time here, or maybe it's not, and you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe now. I will wait for you for a second. Views are good, comments are great, but subscriptions are really important. Help me grow. Today I'm going to be talking about Fred and Rose West. Anybody growing up in the UK will definitely know their names. Even if you're a young person, you'll have heard, if you're interested in crime, about the serial killers that really did take the breath away from pretty much every UK resident, man, woman or child, when these gruesome discoveries of murders were made. But let's run through who Fred and who Rose West really were. Well, Fred was born on the 29th of September 1941. He was born in Bickerton Cottage, Muchmarcle in Herefordshire. It's a really rural area. It's got lots and lots of farmland. And as the first surviving child of Walter and Daisy, he was one of 6 surviving siblings. So there were 8 children born in total, but 2 were stillborn. It was one of those communities, everybody knew each other. It was poor, but it was close, and it was made up mostly of farm workers. Now, one of the things that's notable about his childhood is that his father was quite a disciplinarian. So his father apparently was quite aggressive in his discipline, but we have to remember we're going back to very early on, 1941. It was not a time where parents were as compassionate, shall we say, in the way they treat their children as we'd expect now. Hitting, disciplining, making children do chores were very much part and parcel of family life in those times. So nothing too unusual in that context. Fred's mother was meant to be really overprotective though. She was maybe aware that he was the favourite because he was the surviving child and her firstborn that did survive. Maybe that was the impetus for her having those strong feelings towards him. But certainly his siblings said that when he was growing up, he was the golden boy. Now, when Fred was 5, the family moved to Moorcroft Cottage at Moorcroft Farm, and his dad actually worked there. His dad was a milking handsman. He was a harvest hand, which was obviously what happened a lot in that area. That was where the employment was. In fact, as Fred grew up, he himself would work on the land, and it was part of what his siblings would also help out with. It was important that they all contributed because money was tight. Now, as I've said, all the children worked on the farm, but this is where Fred seemed to develop his really strong work ethic. It wasn't the same at school. You know, schoolmates remember that he was scruffy, dim, lethargic, and he was constantly in trouble. And it actually led to him dropping out of school as a teen. And actually, when he did drop out of school, Fred was barely literate. In fact, I think these days it would have been a likelihood that he would have received a special educational needs statement. So he would have been given some extra help. But for whatever reason, he was always in trouble, things didn't work out for him, and consequently he dropped out. And throughout his childhood, another theme that we see emerging is that he's known for petty theft. So he's constantly pinching, shoplifting, taking things that aren't his. Remember that point, because a lot of his character throughout his life is defined by these behaviours that lead to some assumptions that we can make about the kind of personality or personality disorder indeed that Fred West was experiencing, even very, very early on as a child. Now, whilst the next point that I'm going to introduce is completely disputed by Fred's brother Doug, Fred actually told authorities that he was introduced to sex by his mother at the age of 12, and indeed he was also forced to have sex with animals as a teen. Now, like I said, I've been in a show with Doug and he completely disputes this. In fact, it's really hard for Doug to even empathise with any circumstance regarding what Fred played out to be. He remembers him as his brother, but for whatever reason, there is this complete discrepancy. Fred absolutely told the authorities that he was sexually molested by his mother, and he was also forced to perform acts of bestiality, which, if you think about that, how that would be as a child, what kind of an impact that would have on you if the people that you love and trust were forcing you to do things that were reprehensible. It's going to confuse you. And we know when children are sexually molested, it also interferes with their developing sexuality. For the most part, those kind of impacts are quite negative. So feelings of guilt and shame, even though it's nothing to do with the child, but certainly it can cause long-term problems. With Fred, that doesn't seem to be the case. With Fred, it seems to do the opposite. If anything, it incites him to want to have sex in lots of different destructive ways, which we'll come on to later. As I've said, that point is disputed by his brother Doug. So whilst Fred talked about the fact that his mother molested him, he also blamed his father, because he said his father used to openly abuse his sisters. But here we also notice a displacement of responsibility potentially. So Fred trying to pin the blame on others regarding his behaviours. And that's important to note, because as I said, it's been disputed elsewhere, and arguably for Fred, it's easier to some degree to say that he was a victim. Now, in families, I won't deny this, it's quite common that one child in a family will be abused and the other children won't believe it's happening because the others are treated well. And it's possible that certain people in a family are abused and others aren't aware of it, and then when it comes out, they just can't comprehend it. That does happen. So I'm not saying that Fred wasn't abused. In fact, if I'm honest, knowing what I know about Fred West, it would not surprise me if he had been sexually molested, because his behaviour is so brazen and so without moral compass that I would think that something pretty dreadful must have happened to him to start breaking down some of that consciousness that we would expect and conscience around the kind of behaviours that he displayed. Just as a caveat to note, most people, and I mean the vast majority of people who are sexually molested, will never go on to abuse anyone. Quite the contrary. They are so against child molestation because it's happened to them. But for those people who do go on to sexually abuse, we often have a high majority of those who themselves were as children molested. That again, clearly isn't blaming people who are sexually molested, just pointing out that usually the individual doing the subsequent sexual abuse did have encounters of that abuse as a child. The thing that really strikes me though about all of this is that when Fred was questioned about this later on, he just thought that these kind of things were normal, that this is what family life was like. There was nothing atypical about it. You have sex with your kids, you beat your kids. That formulates the very foundation of who Fred West is. Now, by 1957, Fred and his younger brother John, they started attending this youth club back in the day where we used to have youth clubs in places like the UK. And it was common in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s for you to congregate on a weekend and hang out with peers of your age. And he used to do that in Ledbury. Now, one of the things that was really notable about Fred, which made him really identifiable, in fact, was he had a really guttural Herefordshire accent, and that led to him kind of being seen as a country bumpkin. And I wonder, at that point, when you look back and you think, this boy from this kind of strange home environment, feeling different, standing on like a store drum, maybe being made fun of, did it make him angry? Did he see himself as different? You know, he was known at that youth club for really harassing girls. And I'm not talking about wolf whistling. I'm not talking about the odd comment here and there. I'm talking about groping them and grabbing them. And when they showed no interest, he didn't care. He would still go for them. He seemed to have this incredible lack of impulse control. And I want you to just stay with me on that, because what we're going to move on to shortly could to some degree make you go, oh, maybe this is why he acted that way. But at this point, before what we come on to next, I want you to know that he had a lack of impulse control. He had low to no boundaries and a complete lack of regard and understanding regarding the impact that his actions could have upon another person, in this case, upon another young teen. Now, it was reported by girls who did actually give in to his advances, because he was occasionally successful, that even when he was with them, it was never about them. Fred just pleased himself. The girls were just objects to him, to just be used for his pleasure. And again, I want you to keep that in mind, that these girls were just to be used for his self-gratification. Just after Fred's 17th birthday, he bought a motorbike, and within 2 months, he had a really serious accident. And it was serious. He breaks lots of bones, but he also suffers an incredibly serious head injury, and he's actually in a coma for several days, and he has a metal plate put in his head. So that's a really high level brain injury. The fact that they've actually inserted plates in his head shows that that was a really severe injury, and also the fact that he was in a coma for that amount of time. So at this point, we're introduced to something that could have life-changing consequences. And to be honest, this is also something that many of you won't know. It was at this point in his life he developed a lifelong fear of hospitals. And again, keep that in mind, because when we come to the end of this episode, institutions and his fear of them play in potentially to how this played out. He was so severely injured that he actually had to walk with braces for over several months. So it was a really big accident. And at this point, and this is not unusual, people who have brain injuries often have family members and friends saying that they come out of the experience almost a different person. And indeed, Fred's family said his behaviour would switch and he'd start showing really alarming behavioural traits, fits of rage. Now, just 2 years later, at that very same Ledbury Youth Club, he's trying to grope a girl on a fire escape. So remember, he's had this brain injury, he's already got this poor impulse control, and he finds himself in a situation where he's trying to grope this teenage girl. And she is just not having it. She spurns his advances and she punches him. And he falls 2 floors from the fire escape and is believed at that point to suffer permanent brain damage. Now, one of the things that most experts agree on is that frontal lobe damage in the brain as a whole is responsible for higher cognitive functions such as memory, emotions, impulse control, problem solving, social interaction, and motor function. And damage to the neurons or tissue of the frontal lobe can actually lead to personality changes, difficulty concentrating or planning, and impulsivity. But remember, before you start feeling sorry for Fred, he'd already been inappropriately sexually and criminally before this point. Now, this type of injury, we could definitely say, would additionalize the type of problems that he had and certainly add flames to the fire. I think for me, looking back on Fred as a young person, one of the most disturbing elements is when his 13-year-old sister, Kitty, tells her mother that she's pregnant and that Fred's been molesting her. He's 20 at this point, and he's been raping his sister for nearly a year. Just imagine that. He's insatiable. He's got this voracious appetite for sex, and it doesn't matter whether that person wants him or not. He just takes whatever he needs. This is really early on that we're seeing this incredible destructive behaviour and this molestation of children from a really early age. His mother Daisy is absolutely appalled at this news, and according to sources, whilst this was the case and that she felt really upset with him, really upset, she was still willing to defend Fred in court. She would still have taken the stand and defended him, even though her 13-year-old daughter was pregnant by her brother. I mean, this is not unusual, I will be honest with you. In sexual abuse cases, when you can get them to court, because it's very hard getting sexual cases to court like this, but because his sister Kitty was pregnant, to some degree that would have given a stronger case. But nonetheless, she buckles. It's so common because even when you manage to get it through the CPS, just dealing with it. Imagine being 13, pregnant, taking your brother to court. And so the case collapses. One of the repercussions, though, of what happens is that the West family just say he has to leave. Fred is disowned by the whole family. He's banished from the house and he moves in with his Aunt Violet. So in the end, Fred does actually manage to reconcile with his parents, which, if I'm really honest, is pretty shocking to me. I mean, if you think about the message that gives Fred, I mean, if you can get away with raping and impregnating your sister, then what can't you get away with? Consequences matter. And Fred had very few of those in his early life. Even when he's caught for theft or known to harass young girls sexually or even rape his sister, the system doesn't seem to offer any real resistance to his antisocial behaviour. And what's really deeply chilling at this point is when authorities actually ask him about his behaviour to his sister and others, West was quite happy to disclose that this behaviour was endemic within his nature and that he'd been molesting young girls since the early teens. In fact, it's noted that he begs the question, doesn't everyone do that? Again, we are being introduced to a developing psychopath, a man who sees people as objects for his own use and gratification. And of course, when you see a human being, another sentient, feeling person as an object and not as an individual of intrinsic worth, you dehumanize them. And this means you have a far higher tenacity for doing great harm, because if an object gets in your way, well, you can simply remove it, can't you? As I've said, he does actually reconcile with his parents. They forgive him to some degree. The rest of the family don't, for the most part. But the same year that happens, he meets up with an old girlfriend, Rena Costello. Now, they met at his local dance hall in Muchmarkel, and they dated for about 7 months, but then she returned to Scotland, which is where she originally came from. Now, Rena came from a really poor area of Glasgow, and in today's world, she would definitely have been considered vulnerable. She'd been involved in petty crime, and when Fred met her again, she was actually pregnant. She'd also been working as a prostitute, so she had had a really tough life. Now remember, when she meets Fred, this is a time where young women who have found themselves carrying an illegitimate child would have been judged incredibly harshly. You know, Rena's been a prostitute, she's come from a troubled background, but now she's pregnant with an illegitimate child. It is hard. In those times, you were not supported by the state. You were left to your own devices, and she would have been in real trouble. In many ways, I imagine that Fred would have enjoyed that vulnerability. She's pregnant, so she's trapped to some degree, and let's be honest, it would have made sex available to Fred whenever he required it, and he required it a lot. The thing about Rena's pregnancy is that she's actually carrying the child of an Asian bus driver. Now, in the 60s, whilst it's hard to imagine today, dual heritage relationships were frowned on, as was pregnancy out of wedlock, as I've said. So the likelihood is that Rena returned to England because her family were being unsupportive. Now, they meet again and they actually get married. They get married on November the 17th, and the only guest to attend the wedding is Fred's younger brother. And that just tells you something about the family experience. It's obviously very fraught with Fred's wider family. Now, what's really odd is when Fred's stepchild is actually born, Rena and Fred just make up that she'd originally been carrying a child, but she'd miscarried, and that the child that they're now with is one they adopted to help Rena deal with the sadness. And I wonder, was that because Fred was concerned about knowing that he wasn't the biological father? Did he feel emasculated by the idea that she'd become pregnant by another man? Now, soon after, the couple relocate to Coatbridge, and Fred takes a job as what I can only describe as a terrifying position, which is an ice cream van driver. I mean, that's deeply concerning because of the access he has to kids. Imagine that. Just take a step back and think about a sexual deviant child molester delivering ice cream to your children. I mean, kids just implicitly trust them, don't they? They're the people who give them treats. They're the people that they look forward to seeing. Why would you have taken a job like that? I always have this deep suspicion regarding the particular jobs that people take. It's just within me through my experience of the jobs that I've done. I always feel that child molesters surround themselves with the most open opportunities to connect with their prey. And I undoubtedly believe that that's exactly what Fred did. Now, at this point, as we know, Fred finds it very, very difficult to stay in any monogamous relationships. He's having numerous affairs. And his wife has actually had a second child now, Anna Marie, who is Fred's biological daughter. Now, even though Rena is recognised as a really compassionate and quite a loving mum with 2 young children, she's obviously struggling to make ends meet, but she's trying her best. And people noted that. People recognised that whilst Rena was young and she had 2 kids and very little income, she was still trying to be loving and kind to her children. But Fred is absolutely the opposite. He's violent and he's an oppressive father. He even makes the kids' bunk beds into cages, and he lets the children out only when he's at work. Imagine that. Little kids, literally kept in cages unless he's not around. I mean, this is highly abusive behaviour, and it demonstrates the lack of empathy and insight that Fred seems to operate within behaviourally. These are his children. He should be protecting them, but instead he's caging them up like prisoners. Even during this chaotic time, Fred somehow manages to get another woman pregnant during his time in Glasgow. And this leads to Rena having an affair with a man named John McLaughlin. In fact, Fred catches the pair together, and this is so interesting because when he catches John and Rena together, John and he end up in a fight. And on the second punch, when John punches him for a second time, Fred stops fighting. And years later, McLaughlin recalled that Fred couldn't fight men, he could only hurt women. McLaughlin also saw Fred attack Charmaine, and on one particular occasion, this was simply for asking for an ice cream. And this again leads to McLaughlin once again beating Fred up. You can see the difference in morals. You can see that McLaughlin is aware that the way that Fred is acting is reprehensible, and in his belief system, Fred deserves a beating for it. Now, something that many of you might not know about Fred is that the first killing that ever took place was actually of a really young child. And whilst it was considered an accident, in inverted commas, he actually ran over and killed a small boy. The boy was 4 years of age. The police cleared him of any wrongdoing, but the locals felt very differently. Many suggested that Fred intentionally killed the 4-year-old. Now, knowing what we know now, I'm inclined to agree with them, because it makes you wonder, what had he potentially done to that child? Maybe he was concerned the child would tell somebody about his inappropriate behaviour. Maybe he just wanted to hurt the boy. Whether it was an accident or whether it was on purpose, it does lead to Fred leaving Glasgow and returning to the UK. Now, Fred rents a caravan in Bishop's Cleeve, originally taking the kids with him by himself, and shortly after, he's joined not just by Rena, but by her friends Anne McFaul and Isa McNeil, both who came from very vulnerable, challenging backgrounds. What is it about Fred that makes him want so many women around him? I mean, certainly it plays into his voracious sexual appetite, but also you have to think about the chaos that would have been around him. 2 young kids, 3 women, all under one roof. I mean, with a bad temper, when you're prone to violent outbursts, it's easy to imagine how hostile the environment would be. Unsurprisingly, by early 1966, this living situation has become really problematic, and the violence within the household has escalated hugely. But even more disturbing, it appears Fred has now started to abuse his stepdaughter, Charmaine. Again, we're being given insight into Fred West here. Anybody can be his victim, even his stepdaughter, his young stepdaughter. And imagine what that must have been like in that caravan. I mean, there's 3 adult women and Fred West. He's constantly wanting sex. Those children must have been exposed to some really horrible things. It must have been so confusing for them. But then for Charmaine to start being sexually molested by a stepfather, what a toxic, horrible environment that must have been. If it's not bad enough that we're in a situation where there is such toxicity, violence and sexual abuse in this household, Fred decides that Rena needs to earn extra money, so he makes her go back to prostitution. He wants extra income. But this just shows you, it shows you how Fred sees people as possessions. This is his wife, the mother of his child, yet he wants her to sleep with other men. Now, Rena and McNeil understandably grow tired of Fred's mounting aggression, and so they plot an escape. They ask John Trotter, which is McNeil's boyfriend, and McLaughlin, who obviously Fred has had lots of problems with previously, to secretly pick them up. And unfortunately, what they don't know is by this point, Anne McFaul is absolutely besotted with Fred. I mean, you can't quite compute why, but for whatever reason, she's completely obsessed with him. So she decides to really ingratiate herself to Fred by telling him about the plan. So when the men arrive to take them back to Scotland, Fred is literally waiting there for them and a fight ensues. McFaul, at this point, during this altercation, stoically tells the others that she's staying with Fred. And at that point, the police are called and both Rena's children are left with Fred as Rena returns to Scotland. I mean, that's terrifying. Imagine plotting your escape. Imagine wanting to take your children to safety. Imagine knowing what kind of a beast you've been living with, but you have to leave them for your own safety, because that's what she does. It's not that she doesn't care. Rena is not a bad mother. She's chaotic. She's had problems. She's imperfect. But she does love those children. And suddenly she's got to leave them. And you can tell that because in spite of the fact that she moves back to Scotland, she's connected. She remains a connected mother. She often returns to see her children. And as we know, Fred has absolutely no care for his children. So why is he keeping them? I mean, it isn't because he loves them, is it? I mean, it's not because he cares. We know that because of his behaviour. Is it simply that he wants to keep possession of the children? Maybe it's because he knows it punishes Rena. Now, Fred at this point has been working as a driver for a local abattoir, or slaughterhouse, as many of us call them. Now, according to those who worked with him, he appeared to have this really unusual fascination with how the animals were disarticulated and dismembered. He appeared fascinated with how the animals were gutted and deboned, and you can't help wonder if this insight allowed him an almost degree standard qualification for serial killing knowledge. After all, human bodies are no easy feat to manage after death. Now, at this point, Fred West is living with Anne McFaul, and she's pregnant, and she's desperate for him to divorce Rena and to marry her. But Fred has different plans. He kills her. He kills her even though she's pregnant. And not only that, he dismembers her remains. And one of the most disturbing things is that the body had been perfectly disarticulated, and her fingers and her toes had been cut off, and that would be something that would become a trademark of Fred over the years. And many of her phalange bones were missing, potentially kept as a keepsake, mark of a true-born serial killer. Now, surprisingly, a month after this murder, Rena returns to live with Fred, and even more strangely, they appear relatively happy during this period. This is really short-lived, however. A year later, she leaves again, and Fred has no childcare. So the way he deals with that is to take the children to social services and places them in care. Loving, caring father, right? I mean, you have to wonder, don't you? If things would have turned out differently, should Fred and Rena have managed to stay together? But sadly, that isn't how the events unfolded. And in 1969, Fred meets Rose. Rose Letts, just after her 15th birthday. And this was to begin one of the most prolific cases of serial murder the UK has ever borne witness to. Ever the romantic, Fred met Rose then Letts at a bus stop in Cheltenham, and even though Rose was initially disgusted, literally disgusted, by Fred's advances as he was scruffy, and she actually thought he was a tramp, and he was 27, so he was a grown man and also a father of two. She just wasn't interested, but in spite of that, Fred absolutely locked his sights on her. And when he tracked her down at the bread shop that she was working, she was flattered. Now, it's really important to note that Rose had been brought up in incredibly unusual circumstances and also showed some really troubling behaviour from a very young age. In utero, her mother, who suffered from a really severe mental illness, was given ECT, electric convulsive therapy, to treat her depression. Now, I'm going to put in a piece of footage that shows ECT on a patient so that you can notice how the body reacts to the voltage. In fact, before the days that sedation was used for those being given this treatment, patients would routinely bite through their own tongues and even break bones during the therapy. Even today, ECT is met with a mixed reaction as regards to side effects versus the benefits. But it does beg the question, did Rose receive a fetal injury because of this treatment? We absolutely know she had bizarre behaviours as a child. She had fits of rage that were uncontrollable, severe educational developmental delay, and when her mother and father split up and Rose initially remained with her mother, Rose would creep into her younger brother's bedrooms to molest them. She was abusing her younger brothers from a really young age. And she also, when she hit puberty, was known to just walk around the house completely naked. This is actually atypical behaviour for any adolescent who would routinely be expected to grow more self-conscious at this point, whereas Rose appears without these normal protective boundaries. Now, she moves out from her mother's after a year and in with her father. He had schizophrenia, which can be a highly debilitating condition. Now, even though these circumstances could have been difficult for Rose just because of the mental health issues in the family, the situation would have been more bizarre and more unsafe when her own father started routinely raping her. So when Fred meets Rose, we have two individuals with so many sexual scars, experiences of perversion. Both have been active as child molesters and both have learning and developmental delay emotionally and academically. And another thing that they certainly connect over is sexual appetite and a predilection for sexual paraphilia. So, that fateful day at that ordinary bus stop in Cheltenham brought together two equally damaged people with equally damaging outlooks on life. Fred pursued Rose, and when he turned up at that bread shop and eventually wore her down by bringing her a gift and waiting outside, she agreed to be walked home by Fred. And within weeks, she moved into his caravan and began to look after his children. She left the bread shop, and to be honest, with respect to Rose, she was noted at that point to be an affectionate and loving step-parent to the children early on, or at least a childminder, but she kind of took on that motherly role. When Fred, several months later, was introduced to Rose's parents, neither were happy. And in fact, Rose's father threatened Fred with social services if they continued to date. Takes one to know one, right? I imagine that Rose's father, partly jealous, partly holding the ability to sniff out another predator in his sight, knew almost immediately the threat that Fred was to both himself and his daughter. Rose's dad actually followed through with his social services threat when he finds out that Rose is pregnant, though to this day, the rumours are that the baby was in fact Rose's father's child and not Fred's. When he goes to social services about this, Rose is taken to a children's home and she actually remains there until her 16th birthday. But the minute that she hits 16, she leaves and she returns to her parents, not because she's left Fred, simply because he's in prison, serving time for petty theft and failing to pay fines. Now, when he's released, Rose immediately returns to live with him and she's essentially told never to come home again. Predators like Rose's father really do not like losing control. So Fred and Rose move into a new 2-story house in Gloucester and she has her first child, Heather Ann. And only 2 months later, Fred is given a 6.5-month sentence for theft and fraud, leaving Rose at home with a child herself, caring for 2 stepchildren and a new baby. For any mum, 3 kids, when you're bringing them up by yourself, is a challenge, but at 17, the feat would have been almost impossible. Now, we know at this point, Rose started to get violent with Charmaine and Anna Marie. And one of the really sad things that Anna Marie recalls about her half-sister, Charmaine, is that no matter what Rose did, Charmaine wouldn't react. It didn't matter how hard she was beaten. It didn't matter how badly she was abused. Now, there are 2 thought processes behind these. One, it could have been due to learned helplessness, which is a state arrived at when you have no sense of self-power. And the definition of learned helplessness in psychology is a mental state in which an organism is forced to bear adverse stimuli or stimuli that are painful or otherwise unpleasant, and becomes unable or unwilling to avoid subsequent encounters with those stimuli, even if they are escapable, presumably because it has learned that it cannot. In this case, we would refer to the organism as Charmaine, a little helpless child. But others, including her half-sister, have suggested that it was more to do with the fact that Charmaine was defiant. She refused to bow down to Rose, and her half-sister recalled that she was always convinced that her mum would come to save her one day. In fact, Charmaine would often speak about how her real mum would never swear or never hurt her. She always held true to the quality that Rena had taught her as a mother when she was growing up as her child. Now, just before Fred is released from prison, a really chilling event happens. In June 1971, Rose kills Charmaine. She tells neighbours who knew the child that she'd returned to live with her mother. And it appears that after she's murdered Charmaine, Rose puts her body in the coal store outside until Fred comes home so that he can dispose of the body. It's also worth noting that the belief is when Rose West told Fred that she had murdered his stepdaughter, as opposed to acting unhappy, he seemed excited. He seemed glad. He enjoyed the fact that she'd murdered his stepchild. One of the things that is maybe distinct from the other murders that we'll cover afterwards is that Fred denied dismembering this particular child's body. He did remove some of her bones for keepsakes. Maybe as he didn't kill her, he didn't feel the same gratification he did when he killed his previous victim, or who knows, maybe because it was a smaller child, he didn't have the same interest in her body. I'm just making assumptions. To some degree, it really doesn't matter. An innocent child was murdered for absolutely no reason. Now, understandably, Rena comes looking for her daughter. Remember, throughout the years, Rena has always kept in contact. She's always wanted to see her child. And she actually turns up at Fred's sister-in-law's and she asks her where her child is, because Rena's really concerned. She's depressed. She wants to know where her children are. Now, after receiving Fred's Midland Road address, she goes round and she confronts him. And sadly, that's where she meets her end. Rena is strangled, possibly whilst intoxicated, in the back of Fred Ford Popular. She was also restrained, sexually assaulted, and murdered. And what was the crime? She just wanted to see her daughter. The daughter that always believed her mama would come to collect her. I hope somewhere in this universe that Charmaine now knows that that's exactly what her mother did. Whilst Rose is pregnant with her second child, the couple moved to the now infamous 25 Cromwell Street, the three-storey home that I think so many of us have imprinted on our memories. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can see it. I can see the way the 25 is positioned on the side of the house at a slight angle. It's just the way that it resonates with me. Now, Fred and Rose want to buy it. They want to buy the property. They're initially renting it from the Housing Association, but they are offered the opportunity from the local council to buy it for £7,000, and they need money to help finance this. So they convert the upper floors into bed sits. Now, just think about that. That's really convenient, because if you've got bed sits, people are a lot less likely to be concerned about the constant flow of people coming in and out from the home. Well, going in, maybe not always going out. Because, let's be honest, some were not quite as lucky as others. Shortly after Rose gives birth to her second child, she actually starts to begin work as a prostitute. And her services are advertised in Contact magazine, and it's very obviously her. Fred and Rose are not concerned about neighbours, colleagues, people around them knowing exactly what Rose is doing. She basically puts pictures of herself naked in magazines. Also, at this point, Rose is known to have had a really voracious sexual appetite, and she would basically have sex with lodgers, whether they were male or female. She had this insatiable appetite for sex. And one of the things, particularly with women, she was known for was to become more and more brutal in the type of style within her sexual activity. She'd use increasingly large dildos, or she'd suffocate the women. And she'd actually, whilst doing it, abuse them and say that they were pathetic for not being able to take it. And one of the things that we've got to really connect with here is there's a really striking feature about Rose West. It's that fear excited her, and so did pain. If partners seemed to be uncomfortable, as opposed to stopping the behaviour, she'd increase it instead. This kind of violence tended to be specially reserved towards female lovers, but certainly she liked bondage, full stop. She did undoubtedly prefer, however, to have complete power over females. Now, Fred was not left out of these situations. He'd often be involved in threesomes, and it appears that this is where they further connect in their highly antisocial sexual conduct, buying magazines and videos that also included extreme bondage and bestiality. You know, that is a particular paraphernalia. Not a lot of people like viewing that stuff, and certainly bestiality, which is completely illegal in the UK, shows you that they didn't have limits. And what's really disturbing about anybody who doesn't have a limit is that how do they know when somebody else has reached theirs? Now, what's absolutely astonishing about this couple is our absolute lack of moral compass. One room in the house is made by Fred himself into Rose's room. It basically has a red light above the door, hidden cameras within it, so that Fred could watch whilst his wife had sex with clients. And Rose used to wear the key to the room around her neck, and only she was allowed access to it. But imagine that, wearing it around her neck on display. A constant reminder to everyone in the house that it was her dominion. And make no bones about this, she was more dominant than Fred in many ways. She even controlled the household finances. She was often the disciplinarian with the children. She got her way in that home. She was not a weak, coercively controlled woman. She was an absolute predator herself. Now prepare yourself for this next piece of information, because it's absolutely sickening. And even for someone like me, who's dealt with cases like this, gives me the shivers. So in 1977, Rose's father started to at least tolerate Fred and Rose's relationship, and together they decide to open a cafe, which is called the Green Lantern. Now, pretty much it goes into insolvency quickly. But the thing is, when Rose's father, whilst he's working with Fred, finds out that she's prostituting herself, well, just think about that for a minute. You find out whilst you're working with the husband of your daughter that he's got her prostituting herself. You're going to be enraged, appalled, protective. But instead, Rose's father, in my opinion, breaks every possible code that there is. And he just goes regularly to have sex with his daughter at Cromwell Street. By 1983, Rose has given birth to 8 children, 3 of whom were conceived apparently by clients. It's an unusual living situation. A very busy household, lots of strangers walking in and out, very odd sexual practices and activities occurring, and incest. Life at home for the West kids was horrific. They were constantly beaten. They were regularly admitted to A&E. The records show 31 times over the years for apparent accidents in the home. And obviously, these were injuries inflicted by Rose and Fred. And Heather and Stephen, 2 of their children, ran away because of the violence. And even though they returned after several weeks of sleeping rough or staying with their friends, the way they would be welcomed home would to be beaten again. The children were attacked with knives, pans, wooden spoons, and if it were Rose doing the beating, it would be anything that she could lay her hands on, anything that could do the most harm. And even Fred felt her dominion. She actually chased him on one occasion and she went to stab him with a carving knife. He managed to close the door, meaning that the knife was actually stuck in the door. And as he slammed it shut whilst protecting himself, it almost caused her, as her hand went down the knife, she almost lost 3 of her fingers. And she literally just calmly wrapped up her hand and asked Fred to take her to the hospital. These are serious, serious attempts. These are attempts that could have resulted in the killing of any member of the household. Imagine being a child in those circumstances. Imagine the terror, the psychological warfare. And the children were also brutalised sexually by Fred and Rose West together. Let that sink in. Fred and Rose planned and perpetrated sexual abuse against the children, and they had no limits, they had no morals, no protective mechanisms to stop their behaviour. They delighted in every single form of sexual depravity. They were sadistic, and for the most part they were really successful. They were successful partners in crime. What's really sad is Anne-Marie recalls the fact that her first sexual encounter was her father raping her at 8 years old. She was taken down by Rose West, stripped, raped, and then she was told by Rose that this is how it works. This is how it works in families. Don't tell anyone. This is what happens. Imagine how terrifying that would have been. Now, one of the very few victims who actually escaped Fred and Rose West, and believe me, whilst she bore the emotional and psychological scars her whole life, she was still very, very lucky to make it out of Cromwell Street. She was called Caroline Owens. She's no longer alive, but because of her experience, we were given an unusual insight into the type of behaviour that Fred and Rose exhibited. She was hitchhiking at the time. It's very common back in the day. And Fred confessed when he was interviewed by police that he picked her up to see whether Rose would assist him. It was sort of a test for Rose. Would picking up and murdering a stranger be a stretch too far for his sexually sadistic wife? No, it wouldn't be. And Rose actually helped lure Caroline into the car. Rose actually then climbed into the back of the car and within a short time started to inappropriately fondle her. And also at the same time, whilst this girl is in the back of the car being touched by this woman, Fred is firing questions at her, asking whether she'd had sex with a boyfriend that night. And when she starts to resist, he merely turns around and punches her in the face, rendering her unconscious. When they get her back to Cromwell Street, they drug her. And I'm not going to go into the details of the sexual torture that took place, but it was terrifying. It was abhorrent. It was sadistic beyond measure. Caroline was told she was going to be murdered, and Fred suggested he'd murdered hundreds of others. But Caroline was clever, and she realised that when they were abusing her, if she simply accepted what was happening and didn't try to resist, it seemed to calm Rose and Fred. And this is how delusional Rose and Fred were. The next day, they asked her, after torturing her for 24 hours, abducting her, raping her, causing her horrible injury, they asked her if maybe she'd be their nanny. But she's clever, and she realises that if she agrees, it might change the state, and it does. They set her free, and then later on, when she and Rose go to a laundrette together, she makes her escape. She gets home, she's covered in bruises, and she's obviously asked by her mother what the hell has happened. And even though initially she doesn't want to talk to her mum about it, she's really ashamed, she confesses. And her mother straight away takes her to the police. What's really sad about this particular case is that Caroline Owens was incredibly brave, but she doesn't have the inner strength to take the stand. And that means that Fred and Rose get off with a lesser charge of indecent assault. You have to ask yourself at that point, what would have occurred if they had been found guilty of raping and torturing her? Maybe they would have both been sent to prison for quite a long time. Who knows? But certainly it seems that, again, Fred and Rose are able to do some pretty catastrophic things to other human beings, and there aren't that many consequences. Fred and Rose then went on to murder 12 innocent victims, including their own daughter, Heather. They murdered Anna McFaul, Charmaine West, Rena West, Linda Goff, Caroline Cooper, Lucy Partington, Teresa Seigenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Mott, Shirley Robinson, Alison Chambers, and Heather West. The sad story there is obviously that Heather was their elder daughter that they also murdered. So how did this dastardly couple finally get brought to justice? Well, not for the reasons that you'd first imagine. In fact, it happened more by chance than anything else. Fred West was arrested after a child told the police that her friend had been abused by Fred. This led to the youngest 5 children being taken into care, and whilst they were there, even though the case was dropped, the children remained and were questioned constantly by social services, and they started to talk about this family joke. The joke about Heather, the child that they'd been told had gone to work in Devon at a holiday camp. They told the story that the joke in the family was that she was buried under the patio. In fact, it seems that Fred and Rose West would routinely threaten their children with the same fate when they misbehaved. So the police begin searching for Heather. They go looking, can't find a trace. And even though we have the internet now and it's a lot easier to track people with CCTV and everything, the point was even back then, you would expect to be able to find a trace, a job or wages going into a certain bank account, somebody using services, somebody would recognize them, but no. The case is completely cold and it immediately rings alarm bells. They have history. The police are now starting to be suspicious that maybe Heather isn't working away at all. Maybe Heather isn't even alive. And this sees them get a search warrant for the house. Now, when Fred arrives home to see this, it turns out that Rose was already suggesting that she had heard the story too about bodies under the patio. But note that she's at this point already distancing herself from the crimes. Now, Fred does actually try to throw the authorities off scent by suggesting that he'd actually recently seen his daughter, but by the following day, he suddenly had this dramatic change of heart, resulting in him telling the authorities that he had, in fact, strangled his daughter to death and decapitated her using a serrated knife. But he also made it clear at this point that Rose had nothing to do with it. Strange that. 24 hours with Rose, suddenly confessing. Of course, she isn't involved. Who is in control in this relationship? It seems that this confession was an attempt to stop the police from continuing their search and implicating his wife, Rose, in all those sick rapes, tortures, and murders. And even when they found more bodies, Fred tried to take the blame. But what kind of makes you take your breath away is that Rose seemed to be more than happy to allow him. The man that she loves, the man that she's happily raped, abused, tortured, murdered people with, she's happy for him to take the fall. Who loves who in this weird relationship? Of course, this didn't kind of work out for Rose, because remember Fred's first stepchild, Charmaine, the one that Rose was looking after? Well, she murdered her whilst Fred was in prison, meaning that Rose is exposed as the killer and meaning that she too is arrested and charged with murder. Now, following the arrest, the next time Fred and Rose were actually together was to face each other in court. And it's reported that Fred was stunned when Rose showed absolutely no emotion towards him. She just sat stony-faced, ignoring him. Even Fred West, the serial killer, found that difficult to process. But it makes you really consider who was in control. It does seem, however, that this is a cut too deep, even for Fred West. This depraved man, in spite of everything he's done, can't believe that Rose has dismissed him. And he begins to answer no comment when questioned by the police. And that means Rose is no longer exempt from the guilt in these murders. The thing about Fred is he never did get his justice. Not in this world, at least. He killed himself on January the 1st, 1995. Just 2 weeks before the trial was due to take place. His suicide note read, "Well, Rose, it's your birthday on the 29th of November, and you'll be 41, and still beautiful, and still lovely, and I love you. We'll always be in love. The most wonderful thing in my life was when I met you, Our love is special to us. So keep your promises to me. You know what they are. Where we are put together forever and ever is up to you. We loved Heather, both of us. I would love Charmaine to be with Heather and Rena. You will always be Mrs. West all over the world. That's important to me and to you. I haven't got you a present, but all I have is my life. I will give it to you, my darling. When you're ready, come to me. I'll be waiting for you. Underneath the note was a drawing of a gravestone with the words, "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West, rest in peace where no shadow falls. In perfect peace he waits for Rose, his wife." Lovely words. Just a shame that they came from the mouth of a man who annihilated his own children. Rose's reaction to this was relief. She was busy plotting her get out of jail free card, all based on blaming Fred. And now he's dead. She had a perfect opportunity, right? Wrong. She was charged and found guilty of 10 murders and will spend the rest of her life in prison and hopefully the rest of eternity in hell, along with Fred. That particular couple are what's known as a folie. Would they ever have acted that way if they hadn't have managed to just connect at that bus stop? Who knows? But what we do know is the likelihood is that Fred West alone murdered far more than the women's faces that we got to know through the papers, and that Rose indeed was probably an accomplice in many more crimes. We haven't got evidence for that, but the veracity and the amount of people that he killed and the history of criminality would suggest that the faces that we met are not the only faces that met their doom with that couple. You'll note I didn't go into great detail about the murders that took place. I don't want to dismantle each individual who lived lives fully until they were ended by those horrific individuals. Sexual molestation, abuse, rape, murder are not things that we should spend time exploring graphically, because it means that we deny the human that was before the end. So I hope you understand that this was more about trying to connect with who formed Fred and Rose, why they grew into the people that they became, and also whether there were any signs that could have been explored prior to their offences that in today's life might mean that we would avoid these kind of situations. We've moved on such a great deal. These days, children with conduct disorder are noticed, there are therapy programs, children who are molesting other children at a young age are dealt with securely and properly, and social services are far more engaged in children's services to protect them. You would hope that that will mean that we will never get another Fred and Rose West. The only other couple in the UK that you could say has similar typography is Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Literally, humans that should never have met. Because when they did, it's like the devil took over. I hope you enjoyed to some degree what I've talked about today. I know it's not an enjoyable subject. I hope that you'll join me again next week. Please make sure to subscribe, it makes a big difference. Let me know what you think about Fred and Rose. Do you believe it's nature or nurture or both? Is it that they were both born that way, or were they created by the environments that grew them? Over to you.